there, and thank you for tapping into this episode of Bandwidth Coast to Coast. This conversation covers a healthy amount of ground, and unintentionally dovetails quite well with the previous episode on the Chinese government's external propaganda. This one, though, is with returning guest, Rowan Price. Rowan is an internet nomad, currently living in the EU, and is generally a wealth of knowledge and everything modern history, literature, politics, and much, much more. Some might remember him from episode 2, where I interview him about his experience living and working near the World Trade Center in 2001. In this installment, though, we start off chatting about consciousness after Rowan plays some linguistic judo with my typical question to guests about their happiness. And after we play around a bit with what is or is not a summation of who you are as a being, we chit-chat about the establishment media's propaganda and narratives that emerge in times of crisis, dive a bit into the Romans and the propaganda brilliance of Julius Caesar by way of Pax Americana as a means of American imperialism, before talking about modern nation-states, the rise of corporations, and ending on a bit of a cliffhanger, where we only initiate a conversation about Web3 when I unfortunately had to cut the conversation short. But don't be worried, there's a second installment coming very soon. Thank you, Rowan, for coming on the show, and thank you all for listening. Real quick before the episode begins, if you like what you hear, please tap that follow or subscribe button. You also can find this episode, all episodes in the series, or check out our Daily Minute podcast by visiting us at bandwidth.productions. Hey, I can say hey now. Well, thank you for taking the time again, Rowan. I'm stoked to chat again. I'm always stoked to chat with you. I didn't ask you this last time, so I'm going to kick it off, which is the question I usually ask the first time people join, which is, what do you like to do that makes you happy?
Oh, see, I'm not qualified to answer this question because I've listened to your podcast too many times. So I know the cheat codes.
You know what's coming, so you already thought about it.
Well, no, I think yes, I've already thought about it, but the problem is that I was already influenced by one of the previous guest answers, because you had a guest who said, I think he just kind of reframed the question and said, what is happiness? Does it exist, and is it valuable? And then I think you kind of settled on something more like contentment or experience as having more virtue than happiness. And I think I'm there too. I think one of the really easy to remember, catchy, wise statements from Joseph Campbell was, because he was that the answer to the meaning of life is to experience the rapture of being. And we talked about that before. I think we talked about that, right?
I'm not sure where we talked about that, but
I'm not sure if we chatted about it or talked about it verbally, but we talked about experiencing the rapture of being. Then we kind of unpacked it and unfolded it into something bigger than that, and decided that he really compressed a lot into that statement. But I mean, that's kind of around it. That's like a close answer. Like experiencing the rapture of being. That's the closest I've come to how I become happy, or how I be happy, or whatever happiness means.
Where are you when that happens?
That's the cool thing, is that you could be in the most mundane place. Like you could be in a dentist's office reading a back issue of People magazine, and you could be experiencing the rapture of being. So which is kind of nice, because it's flexible that way. You don't have to be riding a killer wave in Costa Rica or something on a surfboard.
You could a back issue of People magazine in a dentist office. That's great. If you can find contentment, and if you can be experiencing the rapture of being alive while reading through whatever Jennifer Aniston was doing last a couple months ago, I think that is you've reached it. You might as well just like call it a day.
Well, yeah, you might, you maybe you've reached like, the temporary enlightenment.
Well, this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. And like the way that we in the West talk about enlightenment, it's actually so backwards, because we almost seem like it's the final destination. It's like, oh, you become enlightened and then, you're done. Like that's the peak, peak consciousness, or however you want to define that. When really it's that you just experience the world for what it is and accept it. And that's just the start. It's like you become enlightened, and then it's like, yeah, you got a ways to go still, man. You now just you were finally able to open the door and keep it open.
Exactly. When I first heard the term temporary enlightenment, when I had a course when I was a teenager, because I had a teacher who was really into it, and I thought it was a footnote or like an interesting detail, but later in life I realized maybe wasn't, maybe that's the kind of core of it. Is the core of it is that you go through cycles of not just experiencing enlightenment, but even experiencing insight or contentment, and you fall out of them, unfortunately, and you have to fight back in, or get back in, or fall back in. You have to accept that, a more cyclical nature of reality, I think, even if for something as cool as enlightenment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I was talking with a friend of mine recently, and he was saying like source, like the concept. He grew up native on a Native American reservation, and he's Choctaw. So his like talking of source and spirituality and things like that's like it. Sometimes I guess at face value, if you didn't know that context, it may sound like an Instagram influencer, but when he talks about it, like he has a much deeper connection to this. He's meaning a lot more than even I could understand and really grasp all he's expressing. But he said to me recently, he's like, yeah, well, like source moves. And I was like, huh? He's like, yeah, it's like never fixed. He's like, like I guess what some people would call God, or like the universal channeling of it from another realm or something like that. And he was expressing how it moves around. And then when I ended up like having a thought on later and asking him about, which he confirmed, is really what it means is like that inspiration that comes and goes from you and fluctuates is kind of part of this ever expanding, moving, shifting type of consciousness that is all connected to everything, where you kind of realize that universal, I'm different and the same as everything around me, and everything around me is dependent as much as, connected to me.
Yeah.
That, that mushroom trip kind of feel.
Yeah. That's such a great way to frame it. Source moves. First of all, it's so succinct. It's two words. The first word makes you rethink what God, or I think the term the Great Spirit, which is a traditional label in English for that kind of the Native American belief systems. That's so
Well, certain
hackneyed.
sects, because it's very, very big and different.
Oh, right, sure. So yeah, so then there again, hard to paint like all these different cultures with the same brush. But just the term, my point is the term "the Great Spirit" is a like cartoonish kind of term at this point. So because it's used in that way. So I love
Yes.
the word choice, source. That's really, but it's a really interesting like point to make, that it moves, it kind of shifts. I like that.
Yeah, if you can like hold on to it without having too much baggage and judgment, right? Because it sounds kind of out there and goofy if you're in your logical brain. Like you're telling me that there's
Yeah.
a spirit that's following me around and connecting me to everything, and how am I connected to everything? Like what the hell are you talking about? But something I've been thinking about with that is like how narrow of a band when we define consciousness, and like the baggage that the word consciousness has in, Anglo-American life, let me put it that way, instead of even saying West, um, is very small. It's really just like, it really just means human thought, human ideas, human capabilities. Like that's what we are really meaning when we say consciousness. when in reality, like there's might be your consciousness and like what your thoughts arise to you is a summation of everything that you've experienced and everything that's alive within you. So think of like muscle memory of like, flinching or something like that. That's like that's a part of your consciousness. You feel that. You feel the aftershock of that. But really the aftershock of adrenaline that you're feeling is really just a result of your connection of your tissues and your muscles and fast twitch fibers that are like jolting you. And then you're experiencing a second later.
Mm-hmm.
And then even further, that's even a better example, if you ask me, is like if you start eating a lot of sugar, your gut biome starts
Mm-hmm.
becoming addicted to it and it starts propagating off of eating that. So those sugar cravings that you get is actually your gut biome like demanding that you eat more and feed it what it's used to right now, which is really the consciousness
Oh,
of those
it's like an
microbes.
animal dying,
Yes, right,
or an
exactly.
animal afraid of dying or about to die because it's not getting the food that it relies on,
Right, which is means that there's little
adaptatively speaking.
yes, there's little microorganisms that are screaming that from their consciousness, feed me a Snickers bar, and you're getting that,
Yeah.
and you're running
Who
to
can blame them? That's what you've been feeding. That's what you've been feeding them. It makes sense. That's so interesting though. That is a manifestation of consciousness, like little beings in your body, like sending signals to you, like they represent themselves as pain that are based in wanting a Snickers bar.
right.
Damn.
But we don't think of it as
Yeah.
consciousness. And like I'm sure people have heard this before too. Like, oh yeah, yeah, like if you those sugar cravings are really like your gut biome and things like that. Like I've heard that before, like offhandedly. But more recently I've been making the connection. It's like, oh my God, that's actually consciousness. Like, like it's maybe a thin band of consciousness of which they only understand like in their most immediate environment. And, like the
Mm-hmm.
thoughts that arise from them aren't, put into words, obviously. And maybe they are only because of the interfaces that they have with the world. Maybe they don't have like sight or sound or the things like that, or maybe they have like something else like electromagnetic senses and sensibilities, like we know fish have. Maybe it has another
Yeah.
band of senses that we don't have, and we couldn't understand how it experiences that, but it has consciousness. I mean, come on. I mean, fungus will
Yeah.
expand in certain predictable ways, following certain patterns, and it clearly prefers some things and dislikes other things, and will produce things in order to ward things off. I mean, it's thinking. It has to be thinking, right?
Yeah. It is a form of thought, and it's a form of reacting to the world. And what's also interesting about the whole paradigm that you're setting out here is that we're, in terms of gut, your gut biome, is that we think of those things as us, like you're saying, like we think of that as part of, but obviously that you could say from a rational perspective, from the biologist perspective, you can say, well, that certainly a different creature, different living being than you. You just happen to live in the same in proximity. So like your consciousness becomes what it becomes you, whatever that is, plus um, millions or thousands of other beings that live really close to you. That's what a so-called consciousness is, which speaks to the interconnection of things.
Is it plus or is it equals?
Is it is your conscious? What do you mean? Is what plus? Is your consciousness plus or
Is the
equals the?
microbiome of your gut and your consciousness at plus, or is it equals? Because here's the thing: you need that. You wouldn't survive if you had none of those same things that are screaming to you for sugar. If you had none of them, you wouldn't physically, biologically survive. And
Mm,
how much of what your thoughts that arise with you are like, are they? Is that different, or is it a sum? Is the summary of all of those who you are? Because also, like, think of pain. So, like, right now, my
hmm
calves really hurt me, and I can't stop thinking about how my calves hurt me. Is that separate from me, or is that equaling me? And then, in which case, is the muscles in my calves, which are little cells screaming, different or a part of?
Yeah, I mean, I think for our intents and for our purposes, like in continuing this metaphor, it seems like the pain in your calf is equals, whereas the gut biome is plus, and that, you know, plus means it's something, it's you plus something else. Yeah, I think it's, yeah, it's what I think it is. I think it's like a group. It's like a big group of creatures, and you're one of those creatures, and together you're helping your body survive, by having the right impulses to take in the right substances to keep your life happening. You know, to keep your keep your calorie intake happening, and so on. Your
That's
calorie,
interesting.
your sugar, and all other stuff you need to survive.
Is the reason that you say that one is equal and the other is plus because of the interface between the cells? So, like in your muscles and your leg has a tight interface, even though those individual cells are different and serve their own, you know, mechanisms to survive in such the same way as those little microbiomes. But the difference with microbiomes is the interface with you is chemical at like a
Yeah.
more further degree.
Yeah, I mean, it's, yeah, totally. It's, I'm making a completely arbitrary distinction. You could definitely set the marker between what is you and what is another being in a different place. And you could easily make the argument that the cells themselves are separate beings from you. They're living things, and they are not necessarily you. They just happen to like be a part of you, but they're their own entities with their own experiences of the universe. So in that, certainly, yeah, I made an arbitrary distinction because we give the name biomes when we think of, we can, you know, we can kind of picture little creatures living in the gut, but we don't picture creatures living in our muscle tissue. But certainly you can, and I think it's interesting to play with where you set the boundary between what is you and what is creatures that make up you and comprise you, I guess.
Yeah, which is really what I'm just poking around with. Because
Totally.
this is fun. Uh, the last thing I'll say with this, just before we can move on, is that eventually every single cell in your body will be replaced.
Right.
Right. So.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. That's interesting too.
right. So it's like if every part of you is replaced, but your consciousness lives on, what is it? And I see personally, I think it's the summary. I think it's the summation of everything around you or everything inside of you biologically, because all of that influences your thought patterns, how you think, where you think, what arises, all of that. And it's all an interface within you. So it comprises you. And then I think in much the same way, you're influenced in a different way with the external world is in some way a part of your consciousness, unless you're able to arise over it. So again, what I mean by that is like, if you're in a room with a bunch of people who are nervous, it's going to be really hard for you not to all of a sudden have nervous, anxious energy, right? Like they influence
Yeah.
you. Like
Yeah.
there's an interface with that in a similar way to the, you know, screaming for sugar in your gut. And unless you can like, you know, get to the point of being able to make the distinction, and, you know, kind of that frame of contentment or finding bliss reading a People magazine. Once you could do that, then the interface with the outside world is a little different. But I think until you're able to reach that state, it's almost like the outside world is a part of your consciousness rather tightly, right? If you can continue this
Yeah.
esoteric metaphor.
Yeah. 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 No, that's there's a that's a really important subject. Let me just say that. So I think I'm glad that you probed it so much, because it's really important to think about what we're made of and how we're connected to other things, and to question the idea that we are separate from one another and separate from other things in the universe. I think a lot of our problems come from making those arbitrary distinctions, like the one I made, you know, between cells that create pain in your tissue and gut biomes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the part that I find it interesting about that is because if you get to that point, then all of a sudden the interface between two different people starts to become a little different. And then the understanding of those two different people and what thoughts and emotions arise with them, which then changes their locomotion and how they interact with the world around them. I personally think that it starts to arise more empathy, or at least that's usually what I'm aiming for, is to have more empathy for people and a deeper understanding, especially in the mixed up, messed up world of today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, look at it's just, this is changing the course of our conversation a little bit, but we have a war going on, and we have enmity propagated between people that aren't even involved in the war directly at all. So maybe, for example, could be a citizen, a normal person who is working in a dentist's office in Russia, and another person who's working in a dentist's office somewhere in the United States, and they really could be like fairly empathic with one another because they both have to work in a dentist's office, and look at the same old 4-month-old People magazines, or whatever they read there in Russia. So I think there's something to it that can be applied in our material world.
Yeah, definitely. I wish I knew the word for people. Oh, there's always room for empathy, I think. And I wish I knew the word for people magazine in Russian. The only thing I would add to that is that there's many wars going on, right? You said there's a war going on, and there's actually many wars going on. I mean, Ethiopia is in a pretty terrible civil war going on right now. The one that I always bring up is Yemen, because the reason I bring that up is because it's the only war that potentially we as Americans can stop instantly with nothing more than a phone call saying, yo, stop giving logistical support and intelligence to the Saudis. Then all of a sudden that war in Yemen, which is resulting in a famine that's been going on since 2014. So imagine that, a famine, like you're watching people starve to death, which is always children first, because children demand the most amount of calories and need the most broad nutrition. So there's many wars going on. It just seems that there's only one that we should be caring about. And because there's only one that we should be caring about, the propaganda seems to be steering us in such a way to rally and praise the war, and in some places rather blatantly saying that we should praise the prospect of a nuclear conflict, which baffles me.
Yeah, which is astounding. Yeah, I mean, it's just an astounding form of death wish. I mean, it's just really.
Well, I think both political parties are death cults.
Worse than a death wish.
I think both political parties are death cults. I
Definitely.
mean, they just praise war and want access and everything. It's really outrageous.
Yeah, I mean, it's become so much a part of, in the last 2 months, last month, it's become such a basic assumption that the war is good, and the war in the Ukraine is inevitable. That's the big problem, is that the assumption that it's inevitable, which was false, and the assumption that it needs to continue inevitably, also a horrible assumption embraced by both political parties in the U.S. for the most part, with horrible consequences.
Completely agree.
It's just amazing to me that not doing everything you can to end the war is not the first objective. Setting aside not inviting the potential of a large conventional war, or even a nuclear war, but even a larger conventional war between the U.S. and Russia would be a catastrophe. Between NATO and Russia would be a catastrophe. But just look at the difference. I looked at the difference between CNN.com homepage and the Ankara Daily, which is the biggest, or the Istanbul Daily, which is the biggest circulation newspaper in Turkey, which is no country is neutral, but they're kind of playing this neutral role because they kind of have they have alliances with both sides, and they are helping to broker the peace talks. And it's just a huge difference. I mean, in the Istanbul Daily, you've got, okay, today we talked about X, Y, and Z with regards to peace. This is the offer from this side. This is the offer from the other side. That's something. And like progress is made, because often then there's been progress made on many, many days in the last month towards peace talks. And then CNN, it's like Zelensky in a dramatic pose, saying that if the peace deal isn't met soon, it's going to be World War III. It's like, it's quite a contrast.
Actually, I wanted to bring this up, so I'm glad that you did, which is the other thing that I think is a glaring, it's just being glaringly allowed and not questioned, is that we're allowing only one side to speak, and we're literally getting up and clapping and praising, the only side that we're allowed to speak being Zelensky, as demanding us to pull ourselves more in with more military aid, as opposed to saying, use your strength and power as, the United States empire and end the war through peace. Help us end through peace. Instead, it's, get involved in a war with only your Air Force first, which is what a no-fly zone is, and then send us more javelins and technology, which is startling to me, because I think, The Unheard and Michael Tracy both had great articles just recently about saying that this is really because the United States is not suing for peace, and further cutting ties. And I mean, now there's talks of Janet Yellen and a bunch of these senators wanting to freeze Russian gold reserves in the United States, which is terrible and will fracture the entire banking system and economic system we have in the world today, more than it already is with the weaponization of SWIFT. But it was talking about how the United States is clearly going for regime change, and that's what they want in Russia, which is like our foreign policy MO, which is what we did in the Ukraine. Is in 2014 we encouraged a regime change. So it's startling to me, and it's starting to me how obvious it is, and how obvious the propaganda around it is, like calling the gas prices Putin's price hike and bringing in TikTok influencers to spread the propaganda. It's like, it's literally obvious.
Yeah, right.
It's glaringly obvious.
Let's listen to 17-year-olds advise us on international policy and war policy and issues which could, if not dealt with properly, lead to mass starvation, mass financial chaos, mass poverty, and nuclear war. I mean,
well, at least one of those is going to happen. I mean, 25% of the world's wheat is grown in Russia and the Ukraine, and majority of the world's fertilizer and fertilizer like byproducts, like I think it's like, I don't know if it's I know it's urea is one of them. I only remember that because it's such a disgusting name. But it all comes from Russia, and Russia's banning the export of fertilizer now. And also, mind you, like some countries in the Middle East get 75% of their wheat from Ukraine. So in Yemen is also starving, right? But think of like Egypt. Egypt used to be the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, and for many empires, right? Well, now it gets the majority of its wheat imported. So
imported,
right. And planting season in Ukraine is like 2 weeks away. So then there's no fertilizer exports, like zero. There's zero fertilizer exports from Russia. China's been hoarding all the grain for the past 2 years. Bad drought in the United States. And you're not going to plant if the farmers are stealing tanks and having to worry about bombs, which is what's happening. So I mean, it's going to be not good.
Yeah, no, I see it. It's kind of a Mexican standoff right now. And it's a Mexican standoff between the US establishment and a much smaller and much less powerful rival that is nevertheless powerful enough to stand off. And you could lose the standoff because they just it's just a fact. They have, like you said, they have food power. I mean, food is the historically throughout world history, I would say that the number one thing that is in contention, in terms of what governments contend for and sell, and followed by, well, I would say staple food, which people need, and then kind of discretionarily consumed food, luxury. I mean, I think the ancient Greeks were selling olive oil to the rest of the Mediterranean like 3,000 years ago. They didn't need it; they just wanted it. So Russia has that. I mean, they have, with fertilizer, they have the ability to supply a lot of the world's kind of discretionary food, and that with wheat, they have a lot of staple food that's available for purchase on the market. Like you're saying, they control a lot of gas. I know some people that live in cities like Berlin that keep warm at night because there's Russian gas keeping them warm. They have a lot of leverage that's not just military. And then, of course, the military leverage is enormous. I mean, what gets me is I'm learning. I've always kind of been skeptical of anyone who, well, I've always been skeptical of war in general. And that goes back before the Iraq War. I've always been skeptical of war. I was skeptical of the first Iraq War when I was a teenager. I went to a protest of it in 1991 in Portland, Oregon, because I thought it was a bad idea to start a war. And that just was my thinking on it, based on what little I knew about the world. And so it's not like I'm surprised or shocked that the entire US government and mainstream media and establishment is so rabidly pro-war. But I guess I'm surprised by the level of propaganda that is being, it's like a tidal wave that's being thrown at people so fast that you can't make sense of it. Like, I just had someone I respect a lot who I think of as someone who's always been against war in general, non-self-defense war in general, who sent me an article published in Amazon.com/Washington Post, aka the Washington Post, that kind of like, it was like the worst hit piece on Putin I've ever read. It was like, moments after, first it led off like claiming that he had this long, rambling, chaotic, nonsensical pre-invasion speech. And I was like, let's see about that. Because I wasn't sure if that was true or not. So I went and looked it up, and the speech is only 27 minutes. And I listened to it without a voiceover, but with subtitles. So you could actually like think about what was being said and hear his inflections. And it wasn't rambling at all. He sort of laid out a really logical case for why he's doing what he's doing. And mind you, I'm still generally opposed to, I'm opposed to what he did. Like, I think that unfortunately he should have sucked it up and had to deal with the consequences of having to suck it up, which I don't think is fair, but I think that's what he should have done because of the immediate human suffering that could have been avoided. So, but I understand why he did it. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that he did it. It was obvious. But this hit piece was like, it just went right into this kind of like fantasy, almost like sci-fi fantasy, Russian Empire fantasist author named Dugin, who writes about the glorious Russian Empire. It was like an Alex Jones rant. It was like, the Russian Empire is going to stretch from Dublin to Tokyo, and it's going to finally unite Eurasia and bring like, it was just kind of like, and then the implication was that this is Putin's brain. But there's no evidence for that. The implication was that this person influences Putin. The implication is that Putin is a mad would-be conqueror that wants to take over the world. And I think and of course, no evidence cited for it whatsoever. But that's in the Washington Post, which is supposedly a newspaper of record, the second most prestigious newspaper in the world's most powerful country after the New York Times, right? Like, it's supposed to be, supposedly it's like a place for you read like reasonable and erudite editorials basically just the worst hit piece on our enemy, essentially. So I'm surprised, John. I'm surprised. I'm actually a bit shocked by the level of propaganda throughout the Western world that I'm seeing right now. It really is catching me off guard, actually. Even after 9/11 and the war in Iraq, I'm still surprised by this.
Let's saddle up and ride because it's just starting.
This should be fun. Well, this gives us the opportunity to experience the rapture of being.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Not
Well,
in the
this is
way
the type
I
of
prefer,
rapture I
but
want.
I
I feel.
mean,
No, I don't want to feel this. I feel like it's
exactly.
I feel like it's end times. Well, you know, Michael Malice has this thing that he talks about that I like a lot, and he says we're taught all about yellow journalism, and we're taught about how there was a time where journalists were spurring up hatred of Native Americans and that genocide and the expansion into the West and inciting a war with Mexico, inciting a war with Spain, all of that there was all this yellow journalism that was around, and we learned about that, and then there's a record scratch, and then all of a sudden with the war in Vietnam we're supposed to just accept that the media is different and not a tool of the state. When it's when
Right.
the sure, maybe there was a point where the media turned on the war in Vietnam, but I mean, when Johnson, shortly after taking office and getting sworn in after Kennedy was assassinated, just starts doubling and tripling our presence in Vietnam, it was somehow seen as a good thing in the news. So yeah, like I think that there's this false sense that we think that the New York Times or just our mass media in general in the US going back to even the 1850s has ever been anything different than what it is, which is a tool of propaganda for the status quo.
Right.
And the status quo, I don't think it's just the government. I think it's the people who try to influence the government who then become part of the government and then from their position in government influence, use that power and that leverage. So it's corporate, it's corporations in America. That's what it is now. It hasn't always been that way, right? It's grown steadily since the early 1900s, but that's the status quo now. Who run the New York Times and obviously so blatantly with the Washington Post, and it seems like every tech billionaire just buys their little minted newspaper now with Salesforce, Mark Benioff owning Time, right? So like they're all conglomerates of corporations, which is what they've always been. And then harkening back to manufacturing consent, they've always been pushing a message like the extrajudicious killings that were happening and wars that were supported with the Contras in Central and South America. Right. I mean, like that was all supported by the New York Times. I mean,
but there's a theatrical difference now, right? Like it's the emperor is like taking off his clothes and saying, what are you going to do?
Well, it's actually, I think the analogy, I think it was you that we were talking about this the other night. I'm not sure. Where I said it's almost as if it's the Wizard of Oz, but there's no curtain anymore, and the wizard is still running Oz.
Yeah. Exactly. Like it's like there's so many actual former employees of the CIA that are now brought on as analysts on one of the biggest cable news channels, MSNBC, and there's so you talked about Salesforce acquiring Time and Amazon acquiring acquiring the Washington Post.
They're founders, just to make a distinction. It wasn't the companies; it was the money from sales. So it was Mark Benioff and Bezos. It wasn't Salesforce and Amazon. Just to make that distinction.
Sure. Oh yeah, right. That's true. Yeah. I'm being a little tongue in cheek when I say Amazon.com/Washington Post, but
I like that and I'm going to use that. But I was just saying for the sake of your argument, making the distinction. Please continue.
Totally. So the point I was going to make, and this always it bothered me when I noticed it in the aughts, and it feels like it just was forgotten by the culture. But MSNBC is literally Microsoft NBC. They literally,
I know.
They funded half of it. They own half of the company. So this model of like tech giant And there's that Mint Press News study that came out where this guy looked at open source information from the Gates Foundation. He basically looked at the Gates.org website where they disclosed their grants and found what 1,003 no, or is it three? I think it was 3,000 news publications around the world. Many of the biggest publications,
They're a
Guardian.
major contributor. So are all the oil companies. So are all the defense companies. So are all the pharmaceutical companies. They're all major contributors to all of the mainstream corporate press.
Yeah. I think you're right, though. I think your bigger point is like really important, that we're under this delusion to some extent that it was ever any different with the mainstream media going back even to the 1800s. And I think that's totally right. I think part of the reason we get that delusion is that there was this period of such immense there was a period of such immense economic prosperity during the 60s and 70s that they could afford to relax their control of the media a little bit, and you get bits and pieces of that. So like if you read something that Chris Hedges talks a lot about. So Chris Hedges was a journalist, and he was the bureau chief for the New York Times, the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times in the 80s and 90s. And he, or maybe it was even up to the early aughts, actually, in the 90s, leading up to the Iraq War. And he comes from a small town in Maine and from a working class background. And so his observation, I think Matt Taibbi has also made the exact same observation. Matt Taibbi, also the son of a journalist, also works as a journalist. Both have pointed out that the default demographic profile of a journalist from World War II up to the kind of like mid aughts was middle class, as opposed to upper middle class to upper class, which is the default profile now of the typical journalist. So like, and what's really tricky about it too, and I know we've chatted about this before, is that gets so cloaked by even like I think even like hipsterness is used to cloak that. So
Yes.
for example, Vice has the veneer of the hipster, of the beard and the tattoo, hipster, but the demographic profile is this kind of neoliberal or neoconservative, upper middle class to upper class, small liberal arts college, in other words, private expensive university. And that's kind of a shift that makes it feel like, oh, well, maybe there was this idealistic time when then a middle class journalist who went to Kansas State had the opportunity to do great investigative reporting. And I think there's something to that for like a few decades, like some of those people slipped through. But I don't think they ever had anything close to control of the media narrative. I mean, look at the mainstream media, even during that time period. As you say, the escalation of the war in Vietnam wasn't decried as it should have been. It wasn't objected to fiercely as it should have been. It was outrageous, right? Because it set the precedent that presidents start wars without the de facto approval of Congress, which is kind of like Caesar crossing the Rubicon. You can't do that.
It is Caesar crossing. Actually, this is something I want to unpack more as my project goes on. But I think that Johnson is the first imperial president. Like I think that that is a Caesar crossing the Rubicon moment in more ways than one, which I won't fully go into because I'll just keep my response to media this time. But no, I think, Taibbi makes a great point of, when it came from Watergate and Deep Throat and how these journalists, celebrity journalists, after they were played by, what's his name? Robert Redford and what was that other? All the President's Men movie. It was Robert Redford and I can't think of his name. He was in Tootsie too. What's his name? The actor's name?
I know who you're talking about, but I can't think of his name.
I can't think of his name. Anyways, Robert Redford and the other guy. And they have this celebrity of journalists, right? So then all of a sudden he started attracting more people. But back in the day, like Woodward and Bernstein didn't have. I think maybe one of them was a college graduate. And either way, like most journalists weren't even college graduates. It was a job that was seen as grinding it out, not necessarily something that you go to school for and have this like proper way of going about and doing. Which I think, the distinction I would make is editors used to have to be more in control and then eventually have to cave for stories. So editors back then were the more tapped into the funding, tapped into who owns the paper, tapped into, okay, well, like if you run this hit piece on that senator, he's on the arms committee and we're not going to get any information from that anymore. Or if you write something bad about this, the access, right? So like the 5 filters in Noam Chomsky's manufactured consent, the funding wasn't as much of a problem because of newspapers back then were more independent and they were subscribed to, more of the readers were paying for it, right?
Right.
But also to your point, economically there was more of a middle class, people were doing better. So more of the groupthink within the nation was more like, well, if you're telling me we have to do this extrajudicious thing, maybe I'll go along with it because things are going pretty well. And if you're saying in order for things to keep going well, we have to do that, like I'll give you some lead on that. So I think the groupthink within the nation was one of more of American exceptionalism, which bought some of these motives we're seeing more today, rather obviously. It bought that some lead, I suppose, in the actions that Americans would tolerate. And then but more now, like it almost is as if editors and corporate owners of these papers don't have to care as much about policing what is published and not published because of the groupthink. So they're all coming from the same group of universities that are all taught roughly the same things, that all have roughly the same political ideologies. And it's kind of like Barry Weiss leaving the New York Times because everyone else around her was calling her crazy. You don't have to police it. You don't have to be like, this is what you should think about Ukraine, because they already think it. It's already in their zeitgeist, right? It's already their status quo, their default setting, their default way of thinking, which is unfortunate because it just means that the propaganda class is ideologically different than, I would say, actual main consciousness of Americans. I think it's quite devoid from it. However, they do still have some control at the margins of being able to stamp out discourse by just flooding it, and to your point, flooding it with information. And if the same companies that run the media are the same companies that the same boards and the same capital is the same in tech companies, which is the same in pharmaceutical companies, and that just means you can control the message on anything, because you control at least the main allowed narrative on those places. I think the world is becoming more decentralized, honestly. I think it's just harder to see, because how do you quantify if there's 100 different things going on as opposed to there's 2 or 3 things happening on these main channels. But I think because of that, it's the truth of the moment is the paradox, which is, it's never been more obvious to see there's propaganda. There's never been more propaganda. It's never been harder to distinguish what is and isn't, because, Stephen Colbert is my favorite propaganda arm of the United States government because of its like, well, and by the United States government, I guess I'm really meaning the corporate backers of the Democratic Party, as well as the same corporate backers of Stephen Colbert. They're the same group of people. So he'll come out and do like outrageous things, like saying, I'll pay a few more bucks a gallon at the gas pump if it means supporting freedom. And then ending the joke with, but I won't have to worry about paying the gas because I drive a Tesla. It's like you drive $100,000 car and you're saying to people who are living paycheck to paycheck, pay an extra $20 every time you fill up your gas tank because you're paying for Ukrainian freedom. Like, what the fuck? So
the co-option of the late night and comedians who do news by mainstream media has been amazing. It's been like so complete. They did such an amazing job of just co-opting all of them. Colbert is the prime example, right? Like the leader of that. but all the SNL people too, they're all just
But I think that's all
establishment hacks,
groupthink, though.
basically.
I think it's okay. So like, I think it's just them hiring the people that would go for those jobs, and it's just changing the blood out enough. You know what I mean? It's killing the cells in your body again and replacing it with new ones so much to the point where the organism is completely different, and it just is perpetuating in such a way. Like, they hired
Yeah.
Stephen Colbert because him ideologically is probably close enough to them so that maybe he doesn't even have the moral thoughts of should I do this or should I not do this. And furthermore, even if he did, he's gonna give the discounting that they want, because you know what I mean. They're hiring the people that they want. They're hiring the people that will, make Joe Rogan horse pill jokes on SNL, and then a couple of weeks later go on and make jokes about how crazy it was that we were wearing masks. And it's like, well, hold on a second, like that's a complete ideological shift you just did. And
Yeah.
and you can see it as them testing the water and being like, clearly they're playing with their messaging because they're about to start changing it because politically they're seeing that the runway is running on that. But to the audience, if you're not really paying attention, it's SNL. It's what do you mean? It's not propaganda. It's SNL. It's like, well,
Yeah, right.
about that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's like sometimes you wonder, right? Like you wonder, do they have any idea? Like Amy Schumer, Hollywood comedian, proposing to invite Zelensky to do a video appearance at the Oscars. Do they have any idea how ridiculous that is? Do they have, I mean, I think that's an extreme case, so yes.
I
But
didn't know that was happening. That's hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, yeah, right. Like that's so outrageous. Like what on so many levels, that's an outrage. But um, like do they know that they are divorced from mainstream consciousness? Because it seems like they are. I'm talking about the Stephen Colberts and the Trevor Noahs and the what's his name, the other guy from SNL that has a late night kind of news show. It doesn't seem like they do. Like it doesn't. I mean, I think it's the same. Same thing is true. The average editorialist at the Washington Post or New York Times, CNN. I don't think they really understand that they're. I don't think they perceive themselves. Most of them perceive themselves as being propagandists, but it looks from the outside perspective, it looks so clear that that's what they are. I don't know if they. I think it's difficult when you're in that position to see it. I think there's so much reinforcement. There's so much messaging coming into your head 24/7 throughout your day. I don't think you can get the perspective you need to get some self-understanding. I think that's the same. They're dealing with the same problem that they're propagating, which is that there's an avalanche of disinformation, and it's just the physical demand on your time it takes to actually sift through it. It's difficult. It's really difficult. It really is devolving into info wars, which is credit to Alex Jones for that choice of brand name, because that is a good name. I mean, it is a good theme.
I think you saw it coming
Alex
beforehand.
Jones, of course.
Honestly, I think you saw it coming. That guy's crazy, and he might be a schizophrenic. But I think he saw it coming, because even if you like, dude, people think he's like this lauded conservative, but I've went back and watched some of his stuff from the Iraq War, and it's fascinating. Like he was like really against invading Iraq and really against invading Afghanistan even. And some of the things he was saying were very pointed. And I mean, before the Sandy Hook thing, he used to go on CNN, which I didn't realize. I didn't realize that up until like fairly recently, he would like go on all this mainstream. Yeah, like just YouTube him appearing on it. There's like he was going on like pretty much up until a year before that Sandy Hook stuff. Which is fascinating, and that's like a complete like expunging of the record kind of thing. But like well, first off, I can't get too far without talking about Shakespeare ever. And like Romeo and Juliet is written as a comedy, except for the timing. So like everything about Romeo and Juliet is a comedy, except for the moment that you would usually have like the punchline is when tragedy happens. So like right up until
Okay.
Tybalt gets killed, if like that's a great scene, and right up until he gets killed, it's like a joke, and it's almost like this like fanciful like ba-da-ba-ba-ba. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh my god, he just died. Like you actually did kill him. Like this did just descend into
Okay,
that,
right.
right? Like Mercutio the whole
Yeah.
time is just like is telling jokes, right? Like he's this like joke character, right? He's almost like a Falstaff or something. Um, and the nurse, the maid, right, the wet nurse of Juliet is just like is everything is it's set up as a comedy, except for the moment that usually you'd have comedic relief with the laughter, you get hit with tragedy. And I feel like that our world that we live in is more and more like that, where like Zelensky getting asked to go
Yeah.
to the Oscars sounds like something from The Simpsons. Like that's hysterical. Like what? But then like when you
Yeah.
realize like no, this is actually happening, it's like, oh my god, you just hit me with tragedy instead of being have the relief of
Right.
laughter. Um
Right. Right.
and dude, I mean like I'm trying to train myself to think of everything as systems. And if I'm looking at this from like a systems lens, um, I think Upton Sinclair's, it's hard to get a man to see something of which his salary depends on him not seeing, right? I think that's part
Yeah.
of it. I think also the system selecting for Hollywood folks that won't buck the status quo because they want to be, a part of the mainstream and loved and liked. And,
Yeah.
I think there's a fair amount of vanity going on with that. Um, and also, I mean, like, in order to get good at being in Hollywood is not the same tools as being good at understanding complexity and nuance and history and human behavior. Because, like, okay, I don't think that um, Putin wants an empire in the way that we think of empire, which is like Rome, the empire should know no bounds. Like, we're going to conquer the world, right? Like, that is the way we think about it
Hmm.
in Europe, right? In the European plateau, because I don't think Europe's a continent, but I won't go into there. So like, that's the way that we just default think about it. What Russia wants is he wants his own sphere of influence. And he's been saying that for 20 years now, right? Right. He
Yeah.
said that the greatest tragedy in, the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. And really what he meant by that is the fall of Russia's place as being seen as important and, a stalwart within the world. So I think really what he's trying to do is saying like, hey, we can have an economy the size of the state of Illinois, and that's all well and good. But guess what? Like, if we don't play the rules of the game that you expect us to, we can still punch above our weight, which is brilliant. He is very smart. Like, think of it like the norms ever since World War II is to, you know, uh, not just randomly invade countries unless you're the United States, right? So
Right.
I'm just gonna say fuck it. And in 2014, I'm gonna invade Crimea, and what was it, 2008? He invaded Georgia. So I mean, like he's just saying like, whatever. I'm
Yeah.
gonna have these little like skirmishes. And John Kerry in 2014 said like, oh, we were surprised by that. That was very 20th century. And it's like, no, it's not. Like that's human behavior for 20,000 years. Like, what do you mean? This
Right.
is like, no. Like
Right.
we haven't changed. You have just allowed your reality to be a false perception of what's possible. And he's taking
Yeah.
advantage of that because Russian skill has always been, and the game is going this way. We're going to find smart ways to go around and trap you and force you to make the decisions we want you to make. And in doing so, we have an
Yeah.
upper hand because Russians, ever since World War One, they were just throwing people with stones at machine gun turrets, right? It's not like they've
Right.
never not been, fighting from a period, having to punch up as far as like technologically and economically. They always have been, but yet we've talked about them for the past 100 years rather intently because we have to. So I mean,
Yeah.
Russia, the sense of like empire, like no, he wants to be taken seriously, and he's going to do
I
what he needs
think
to do to be taken seriously.
right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And the historical context is huge, and that's one of the things that struck me about his pre-invasion speech, the pre-Ukraine invasion speech, was the historical. he's really, really aware of the historical framework. He really operates within a sense of long history. And he gave a really interesting and detailed speech, which I think is pretty unusual for a world leader these days.
Well, it is if you're from the West. If you're from the West, I mean, Xi gives it all the time.
Yeah.
Putin, like when you said 27 minutes, I was like, man, I wonder if we can get Biden just talk uninterrupted for 22 minutes. But anyways, keep going.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, but yeah, I mean, most it's yeah. So yeah, most speeches by major U.S. political figures in the 21st century have been terrible, really. But where I was going with that is that I think one of the things that John Kerry was reacting to in the entire U.S. establishment is Putin puncturing a big hole in this concept of Pax Americana. There is no. It's such a ridiculous concept that it's like I actually was writing about this recently because I was writing about all these kind of. I was writing an article called "The Economy of Fake Theories," and I was evaluating all these marketing and advertising theories. We touched on this briefly. They're basically, it's not that they by themselves are fake or untrue. It's just that they're not scientific theories, right? They're not like the theory of the unique selling proposition is that human beings can only remember one thing. Is there scientific research to support that? No, there's none. The guy who invented the theory was an ad executive and he thought it sounded cool. And if you asked him why, he said it's common sense.
That's hilarious.
And he retired a multimillionaire. So I think Pax Americana is that same kind of, when a theory has a catchy enough name, beware, because that is a very catchy name. It's a great reference to the Roman Empire. It's got the word peace in it. It's got the word Roman in it by implication, and it's got the word America in it. So it just sounds fantastic, and it's total bullshit. I mean, it's the level of war and violence under the so-called Pax Americana is just astounding. It's like the worst name ever. I mean, if anything,
well, actually, I think it's
anything.
If anything, go ahead, finish that.
And if anything, there's a Pax Chinesia or Pax China, if anything. But I don't even think you can make that argument. You certainly can't make the argument for it at Pax Americana.
No, well, I think you can, but it's just how do you define peace? Because I think the Pax Americana is actually perfect. I think it's perfect because of its calling back to Rome, and not just because I'm geeking on it. I'm like looking at like my bookshelf of like half Roman shit right now. So like no, but I think it's necessary for so many dimensions. Like that one, phrase sums up so much. Like it sums up ties to Rome. It sums up the idea of empire. It sums up the idea of exceptionalism. It sums up the idea of hubris. It sums up the idea of just like Western thought in general. And then really what it means, like, was it Tacitus who said the Romans leave a desert and call it peace? So like that is what it is.
I don't know, but
okay, so it's one of the
reference to sowing salt in Carthage.
It's a reference to just how it's referenced to Pax Romanus, which is where Pax Americana comes from, which is the fact that well, it also, all right, I think you can't do this without also talking about how does war start. If you're talking about you're solving the war through peace, what is it that you're starting? And the Romans and the Americans, they even historians, when they talk about America, use the same phrase, which is casus belli. And casus belli is the cause for war, the cause for conflict, right?
Yeah.
So like the Romans they had this thing throughout the traditions of Rome, which was look, we are the new type of civilized, right? We don't care where you come from. You come to Rome, you can be a Roman, right? So, all right, I understand.
Even Kamala Harris?
Oh my God, let's not even go down that door.
Because she could have been a Roman. She could have been a Roman leader.
I don't think so. It requires some skill to actually be able to talk and think at the same time. Right. Anyways, so like you needed a cause for it, and if there was no cause for it and you just started a war, it was seen as being immoral and the gods would smite you. So what they would do is they'd make up bullshit causes for war. which is very much what the U.S. has done forever. You make up bullshit causes for war.
Yeah.
The Mexican-American War is a great example. They just kept stationing troops on the other side of the Rio Grande until eventually they charged at the troops, and it's like, oh well, you charged at us, we're gonna go to war with you now. And it's like, well, you parked your
Right.
troops on the other side of the border, man. But that was enough of a cause for us to say, okay, we're gonna go to war now. And
Yeah.
then from going to war, you then would bring peace by slaughtering everybody and demanding these like ridiculous tributes, and create these client
Yeah.
states, which eventually, some would get absorbed into the empire as new provinces, and other of them would be intentionally like, we're never going to do that because we just want you as cannon fodder to have buffer between us and the barbarians. And how they would bring about peace is by destroying everything and laying everything barren, because the Romans were notorious for, we're going to go to war with everything, and we're not going to take any prisoners except for the slaves that we take, but before then we're just going to steal and slaughter everything, right? Which is in the same way that the America does it, except for instead of pillaging, it's dropping bombs, right? So I would say that Pax Americana is great because of the fact that that's what we do. We leave a city in rubble with bombs and drone strikes and casualties, and we don't talk about those things. We just turn around and walk away, and we say, God, did we do a good job? We're doing great.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, absolutely. It's all about how you define Pax. Yeah. Yeah, certainly. And part of it too, part of the convenience for the US is their geographic remoteness from a lot of the packs that they create. It's
Yes.
there's some like blowback, like we have massive immigration problems, somewhat directly related to Pax Americana in Central America, Central American wars and instability and poverty that directly affects us. And we certainly have, we have a destabilized neighbor to the south. So there's, it's getting a little closer, but generally speaking, it's usually tends to be fairly remote and separated by oceans, which is convenient.
It was Tacitus, by the way, that said
It was Tacitus.
yeah.
It's a good quote. So
they make a desert and call it peace, and they being the Romans.
It reminds me of what I learned about, I don't know if it was Augustus or Caesar, that in the battle with Hannibal in Carthage, which was really amazing because Hannibal took elephants into Europe, and Hannibal was apparently a brilliant person, and he had a lot of things going for him, but he was defeated. And part of the defeat was that Rome went and supposedly dumped salt in the fields around Carthage. So they literally turned Carthage into a desert. I mean, it probably already was partially a desert, but
they did that, and then a few years later, like 20 years later, they found a new Carthage on pretty much the exact same spot because it was just too geographically important. I think that they probably did that, but it was a port city anyways. Like the real beauty of Carthage was that it was just really centrally located in the Mediterranean, and you could get ships in and out, and it had an amazing port. So they actually, the Romans ended up finding New Carthage, which ended up being at points in time more wealthy than Rome, which is why when Caesar, like Gaius Julius Caesar, one of his last battles before the Pax Romanus with the Civil War, was fought in New Carthage. Remember that the famous speech where he refers, he stands up to the legionnaires who are saying, like, we don't want to fight anymore. We want to, get our money that you owe us in our land, and we want to call it a day. And instead of calling them his soldiers, he stood up and said, he referred to them as citizens, which was like a huge blow to them because they're like, we love you, we're your soldiers. And instead of referring to them as legionnaires first, which is how he always did, you refer to them as citizens first, and then razzle the troops to go invade Carthage. which was actually New Carthage at the time, which is where Cicero was, and then Cicero ended up committing suicide there.
Interesting. Interesting, huh?
Yeah, the funny thing too is that the Romans didn't consider North Africa outside of Europe. Because to them it wasn't.
Right. Yeah, it was Europe has a shifting, as a concept, has shifted throughout history, right? It's been it was certainly like very much like a Mediterranean shore-based geographic entity.
Yes, it was. Well, Mediterranean shore going in through east to the borders of India. Because Persia was practically, like, Persia was seen as other, but I mean, economically and technologically wise, it was indistinguishable from the rest of the Mediterranean for most of the time that we think about the West.
Right. You know what else is interesting about that little piece of historical narrative, where the the choice of wording from soldier to citizen kind of changed the relationship and changed the sense of obligation, and did so much. And really, what happened? Well, a Roman leader spoke, and just based on words, like just the word, like small word choice, made such a huge difference. It's such an interesting metaphor for, because in those days that was one of the, I guess, forms of mass communication, was public speeches, right? If you could speak to a few hundred people, that constituted mass communication. Because you mentioned Cicero living in Carthage, and one of my favorite Cicero quotes is when I think it's when Aeschylus spoke, the people said, "He speaks very well." When Demosthenes spoke, the people said, "Let us march against Philip." Megan, I know I've shared that with you before, but it's such a powerful concept. Like he just, it's not that he was a good speaker, it's that he could actually move people. He could move people to do things. He could inspire people to do things. And I mean, that's so powerful. It's so important. That's so important to it. I mean, I think, like, if you look at what strategy is, the missing piece to strategy usually is that inspiration piece, where you really compel people to want to do something instead of just saying, "This is what makes sense." It's like it's really amazing that we're so compelled, we're so inspired. I mean, to hit on this point again, because this is what's happening in our world, but we're so inspired to be so warlike and to be so careless with nuclear holocaust.
Oh my God, yeah.
Like, what the fuck?
Well, when I was the episode that I dropped right before this one's gonna go, about Chinese external propaganda, and I was asking you, like, about your definition of propaganda, because I appreciate how much you're like literally building your own dictionary, and how much you value that and think about that. Yeah, I really appreciate that about you, and I knew you would have something that would be interesting. And I was thinking about it when I was writing that intro essay, and I actually completely rewrote the intro message to that a few times, and I wrote it like probably 10 minutes before I recorded that. And it completely changed everything, because I was trying to think, I was doing research, like, what's the oldest known, document of propaganda, and it was like, thousands of years ago, from like a king essentially giving out false truths to try to rouse a merchant base, I believe is what it was. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. And I was thinking about that, and then it struck me, and I was like, oh my God, I know way more about propaganda in the ancient world than I thought about. Because, I mean, I think I can make a case that there are two people in history. Well, okay, now that I'm thinking about it, I think I can think of hundreds of people in history that were unbelievable in their ability to spread propaganda. If I was to take one that's like, I think Paul is a great propagandist in
Mm-hmm.
his spreading of the Gospels.
Right, right.
And Winston Churchill is an amazing example, and he didn't even shy away from it because he said, I know how I will be perceived in history because I'm going to write it. But it's Julius Caesar. Like Gaius Julius Caesar is probably, outside of some religious fellows, the most effective purveyor and creator of propaganda ever. I mean, first off, we still
Yeah.
remember him, and we remember him
Well,
because of the myth he
he
created
wrote a
while
great book, right?
he wrote several. But here's the thing, like he wrote like we've talked about this because it's used in learning Latin, which is his adventures in Gaul. Like his adventures in Gaul were completely illegal. And from the moment he started doing them, okay, so from context, Gaul is France. France is Gaul. Okay, it's the way to think about it. It's the same there. France is the size of Texas. It's an enormous area. Caesar is stationed and given, Gaius Julius Caesar is given command in Gaul, but it's not, it's about half of France. It's about like if you were to take like a diagonal of, Bordeaux down in a diagonal like
Yeah,
45 degrees, that's about what Gaul was. So like half of Texas
yeah.
was still like a state, half, an area half the size of Texas was still
Greater
not
Normandy.
exactly, was still not in their control. So like where Paris is now, that area was not under control. So he just started seeing a lot of refugees come over because the Gallic people were getting forced out from the Germans. And he just made up a casus belli, a reason for war, to just go slaughter them all. And he killed, on the conservative estimates, are 1 million people, more likely 2.5 if you include like women, children, and elderly and all of that. Um,
Wow.
and it wasn't popular. Like people in Rome didn't want that, especially the ruling elite did not want this war because they didn't think that it had proper cause. And their whole thing was
Mm-hmm.
it needs proper cause. So he wrote these impeccable documents, like explaining, like because of his genocide of Gaul and most other Western writers and cultures in that time kind of looked at them as the other, and it is so weird that they wouldn't even document about it. The best record of what we
Yeah.
have of what the Gallic people are like is Caesar describing the people he's killing. And he
Mm-hmm.
turned the public opinion because he wrote so plainly and so pointedly and so simply, right? Which is
Yeah.
also why it's used as learning Latin. He had a wide audience where people would stand up on
Yeah.
blocks, and your mass communication thing is going to make me think for a while, because people would stand up in blocks and read Caesar's messages. So the populace was all for what he was doing because, one, he's writing these amazing travelogue stories and compelling narratives of what he's doing, while at the
Mm-hmm.
same time he's sending back massive amounts of money, gold, and these strange looking guys in chains, right? So he's sending back all this treasure. He's expanding the empire. He's creating a new myth of what it means to be Roman and what it means to like expand Roman
Yeah.
sphere while
Yeah.
putting himself at the center of it, right? So he did, like, that is one of the most effective pieces of propaganda ever, because if it wasn't for that, there would be no empire in the way that happens because of Octavian, which is his adopted son and nephew, right? Because Octavian Augustus is really the one who set up the empire, but without Caesar, there would be no empire, right? So that piece is 100% the reason. I mean, like Caesar crosses the Rubicon because he comes from the Gallic region, with his 12th Legion, and crosses the Rubicon, and all of a
Yeah.
sudden it becomes the Civil War. Like he's coming. So like this propaganda he wrote is the whole reason that the Civil War popped off when it did. I think the Civil War is inevitable, but I won't get into that. Um, and then furthermore, when he was fighting the Civil War, it wasn't as popular as we perceive it would be, right? And as he's fighting it, it was known and like talked about how Caesar would be riding in a chariot going from one logistical station to another with two scribes below him and telling them what to write. And one would be writing one piece of propaganda or like letter or like narration of what's happening, and then the other one would be writing the opposite. So he'd be writing letters to people constantly, and then the other side he'd be
Yeah.
narrating his travels. Um, and because he was such an effective wielder of this propaganda is why he was able to be so effective. And the same can
Yeah,
be said with
it's a
Stalin.
brilliant thesis. I mean, it makes perfect sense. I mean, it's a really, I think it's, yeah, it's, I think it's, I think it'd be interesting to look at it, from the context of what, of propaganda as a model of communication, political communication, where manufacturing consent is one propaganda model, and define what Caesar's propaganda model was. Certainly, it had a lot to do with what we call othering, but I think that's inadequate to the task of describing what he was doing in terms of dehumanizing or anti-Romanizing Gallic people. Certainly had to do with what you just mentioned, the his use of scribes, his use of a literate, semi-literate public,
Well,
the
he set up the
convention of public criers. Mm-hmm.
he set up the concept of a noble savage. There was probably already a concept there, but the way that we think of like the noble savage in North America with that genocide is the way that he
Mm-hmm.
talked about the Gallic people, which is one of the first times that that's well, not really. I guess all of
Wasn't it?
civilizations kind of looked at indigenous people like that.
Yeah, yeah. I thought Tacitus also talked about Germanic peoples like that, and is credited with.
Well, yeah, that's what Caligulus is the Germanic tribeman who, in Tacitus's story, is the one who says the Romans leave a desert and call it peace. So yeah, Tacitus did that. I
Right.
think Tacitus came after. No, was he before? When was Tacitus alive? I'm gonna look it up.
But yeah, so it's interesting.
Yeah, he was after.
It's
He
a
was after
great
Caesar.
theory. He's after Caesar.
Yeah, 50. He lived at
Um,
56 AD.
because what he had to do is he had to like betray really, really powerful conventions, right? He had to betray the convention of the need for casus belli, and he had to probably other things too that we're maybe not completely aware of. For example, it could have been that there was actually some communication and trade with Gallic peoples, and people knew that they weren't like animals, so he had to betray that
Well,
knowledge. And
there was. So like in the part of Gaul that he was the provincial governor of, the distinction that he makes in the writings and Cicero even talks about it too, is that there was the Gauls that were outside of the Roman Gaul, and then there was the Gauls inside of Roman Gaul, and the way that they made the distinction between the two is it was Gallic people and toga wearing Gauls, and they would talk about how the toga wearing Gauls were the Gallic people that kept their long blonde hair, but started drinking wine and wearing togas.
Right. Okay.
And also, like the other thing too is that in the ancient world, this is something I think about a lot lately, actually, is that the ancient world didn't think of races; they thought about birthplace and cultural adoption. So, like, if you were, so like think of it as like a Gaul. If you were born, if you were like genetically a Gallic person born in Rome, you would be quite a bit taller than everybody, and you would probably have straight blonde hair, where most of the other people had like dark, wavy hair and were quite a bit shorter than you. I mean, you probably would be as conservatively a foot taller, because a lot of the Gauls were like 6 foot tall, right? And most Romans were like 5'5", right? So like you conservatively easily could be a foot taller than everybody. But if you talked like a Roman, spoke Greek, were educated in the cultural norms, they wouldn't look at you as any different. They would look at you as a Roman.
I see.
They don't have the concept of like race and things like that, where the toga wearing Gauls were still, probably speaking with, Latin with an accent. And they talked about how they would get drunk all the time, because in Rome, it was looked down upon to be like outwardly showing that you were intoxicated. You were supposed to be reserved about that, except for on days of festival and all that.
So this is the origin of the French people, the toga wearing wine drinking Gauls. I mean,
Yeah,
it really
except for
is, right?
the Franks kind of mess it all up though, because like the interesting thing about Europe, the European plateau to me is like how much the regions of land just completely get obliterated, and then you don't think about it. Like, um, I mean, Anatolia, which is modern day Turkey, used to be fair-haired, fair-skinned people speaking Greek, and then after the Moorish and Ottoman invasion, it's completely different makeup.
Yeah, right,
It's not at all. It
right.
doesn't look at all look like what it is. Or North Africa, like Morocco used to be you know Greek looking people, right? Morocco isn't really
Right.
like that now. In France, that region
It
of
is in the
France
very
is
small pockets, like the Rift
it is. It's
Mountains
still there.
are the
Yeah.
Atlas Mountains, the Riffiana people. But yeah, it's funny. It's funny how it's funny how it's such a different paradigm to like to favor. It just seems so retrograde that we put so much emphasis on categorization according to external appearance now that we might not have done like thousands of years ago. Like what's where's the human progress in that spectrum? Because that's kind of depressing, right?
Well, it was necessary for the idea of a nation state. A nation state is
The
a
idea of race.
yeah. It was a very useful tool in building a nation state. I mean, nation states are
Yeah, right,
new, right? And how do you categorize
right.
me as different from somebody else? Well, let's find distinctions and draw parallels because innately we as humans are prejudiced tribal folk. So how can you expand a tribe to be the size of
Yeah,
Texas without it having? I mean, because really, like taxes is the way for most of time how nations were put together. Or like I've been reading about Prussia recently, and how like Prussia was an empire that had two portions that weren't connected directly, and how that's like such a
hmm.
wild idea to us. You know what I mean? Like it's wild to me that Michigan has
Isn't
the
it
Upper
wild?
Peninsula that is outside of the contiguous part of it, and that's just
Yeah.
a state that makes absolutely no fucking sense as a concept, let alone an empire. And
Right.
nation states are new. They're new concepts. I think they're stupid concepts. But
Yeah, like they needed whatever they could muster to define themselves as valid entities vis-a-vis what the the kind of big, huge, long-standing elephant in the room, which was formerly the Roman Empire, and then kind of echoes of the Roman Empire with the Eastern so like the Holy Roman, the quote unquote Holy Roman Empire, which basically is Germania, this is
right,
German speaking, which is basically Charlemagne having not being able to pass on, Charlemagne kind of unifying most of Western Europe, and then that never being reconciled um, among his the people that came after him, his sons and the other people that came after him. They could never reconcile that. And in a sense, what became the nation states of France and Germany, which took a long time to happen, it's almost like the sons of Charlemagne, like fighting each other, like for all these years. Even World War II and World War One can be seen as echoes of just Charlemagne's sons, like not being able to work out an accord or an agreement. But yeah, like I find it ridiculous when I read English writers that talk about the French race. I'm like, what are you talking about? How is what do you mean the French race? How is that any different from the English? Or they say the Welsh race. The Welsh race? Are you kidding me? It's like it's like people that are 20 miles over that are a different race that look exactly the same as you. I think it is a totally contrived concept, and it makes sense that it was needed to validate the concept of nation state. Now look how powerful nation states are, but now they're being challenged by corporations. And so now,
I think corporations
are
are
we
the new
gonna
nation state.
go back to one thing that strikes me re-listening to the Odyssey is the power of the social conventions, and how much it ruled people's lives, and how sacrosanct they were as like laws and rules, especially hospitality. A lot of the plots of the Odyssey, which is basically a collection of short stories, revolve around hospitality and how that affects like people traveling, and
Well, and like
so
the Oresteia, that's what it's about. And I mean, Oedipus, that whole trilogy is about hospitality, to even be
right.
hospitable to somebody who is so egregious as to have murdered their mother and, murdered their father and bred with their mother.
Right. So but the nation state comes in with, you know, it's using various building blocks. Probably the biggest building block was enlightenment rationalism.
Colonialism.
Um,
Colonialism.
colonialism.
I think the
Colonialism.
biggest
Sure. Yeah.
building
Right.
block was
You're right.
colonialism. And what
So like,
what sponsors colonialism? Corporations. But they weren't considered corporations then, but they still existed. Just because the idea of a corporation didn't exist doesn't mean that the Dutch East India Company wasn't a corporation, nor does it mean that, Venetian merchants weren't acting as corporations, or, if you want to go back before
right.
that, like Roman expeditionary forces.
Or the Hanseatic League. If you're reading about Prussia, you might have ran into the
I
Hanseatic League.
I
They were sort
briefly,
of a
yeah.
corporation.
Yeah, no, they existed. Like
Um,
these type of things existed in paramilitary forces, as well as like merchant uh, trade kind of, pseudo organizations.
yeah, totally. Like the Hanseatic League had a huge compound in London with like 3,000 people living there. They had their own security and everything.
I didn't know that.
There
That's
was like a
wild.
kind of semi-autonomous, like, zone.
Well, the Knights Templar
And
also were a pretty explicit banking corporation, right?
right. That's right. That's right. They helped finance the Crusades, right?
Well,
The later
their
Crusades.
heyday was after the Crusades, though, because what their big thing was, if you deposit money in any of the Knights Templar banks, you can go to any other of the Knights Templar banks and withdraw it. Because their big thing, like how that came out, was
Right.
people depositing money and then withdrawing it when they're getting close to the Holy Land. What they ended up doing was, leveraging that money to have essentially a banking cartel, which was
Right.
operating in a very similar way to the way we were talking about operating corporations. So, such as to say, like that organization of humans organizing for capital, which is really what corporations are, has been around for, it's ancient in just its current form.
Right.
It's operating the way it is. But really, my way of challenging what you were saying is that I think the concept of a nation state and its intertwining with corporations was probably inevitable, and it probably already was there before it transformed into its current form. It's just looked at more. We just see it differently now, I suppose, because things. I'm more and more thinking that human behavior and what, comes out of it into our reality hasn't changed. It just is different. Like we are still tribal. We still, have prejudice. It's still useful to us in certain ways. We just find different ways to lie to ourselves to say that this existing permutation of the life and the world around us is somehow different, when really it's like, nah, we've been doing this shit forever.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I was trying to draw a distinction between organically derived customs that are passed on from generation to generation, such as the custom of hospitality in the Odyssean world, and the police and military backed customs of the nation state. The nation state, so like, if you can, like, so currency, fiat currency is backed by nation states, which their teeth is the police, the prisons, and the military. So against that backdrop, the Odyssean hospitality tradition doesn't have as much power as it might have had at one time, because like Chomsky makes this point too about, someone asked him um, whether the European colonialization of the Americas represented the worst genocide in human history. And his response was that the nation state has never ever been anywhere close to as powerful as it has been during the 20th century. So the genocides during the 20th century are actually far greater because of the power behind them. There's so much more power for nation states to wield now than was even conceivable at that time. So all of that also is a really interesting backdrop for transitioning. I know you wanted to touch on Web3, because
I don't think we'll have time for it though.
maybe Web3 takes us. What's that?
I don't think we'll have time to really unpack it, but I would love to hear where you're going.
Well, I think maybe Web3 takes us back to social. Well, literally, social contracts is in the Web3 vocabulary, right? So maybe literally Web3 takes us back to the value of social contracts and human interaction, and gets us away from guns and boots enforced contracts.
Yes. I think it can. No, I really think it can. Yes. And I think in order for the nation state to survive, it needs to degrade all other forms of tradition. It needs to degrade the cultural traditions, because if you're bonded any other way other than ways in which the nation state and its means of economy can control and influence, it's a threat to its existence, because it's just an idea. And the idea really should be that the people that comprise that nation state can influence it to be suiting what they want, right? Which is most likely going to be peace and security and comfort. And the mechanism to be able to grow and love. But if you malform that to be in something that's centralized and control, which is really what the nation state requires, you need to degrade all those different other connections. And I think Web3, 100%. No, I completely agree with you. If it is truly decentralized, you can have the framework to have exchange between anything and anyone. And I do have to go in a minute, but I want to unpack that on more.
We should unpack that at a future time, because I think it gives wealthy individuals and organizations of individuals, DAOs are an obvious example, the opportunity to redistribute wealth if they choose to in a way that can't be censored. It's really difficult to stop that communication, and unless you're talking about shutting off electricity. So yeah, there is a lot to unpack there, and I wonder, we're talking so much about Rome, like I wonder how much Web3 can take us back to a world where social contracts have a lot more influence over our lives, which could be a good and a bad thing, but that's I think it's an interesting subject.
No, I would love to unpack that more, and maybe we can quickly schedule another one, and I won't allow so much bracketing, and I'll keep on the subjects that I wanted to talk about, which we didn't even touch upon. And I was dying to make the German connection between Rome and a nation state and the Second Reich, and being able to connect a group of people that had such disjointed different dialects of German, and connect them under the one.
Yeah, a huge part of Germania. Just in fostering intercommunication among a previously disconnected massive group of people. Went far beyond what the Knights Templars and the Hanseatic League did. We're talking about your average middle-class person being able to communicate with millions of other people like him. He doesn't have to be a part of a fancy league or secret society. So that had a huge impact, a huge leveling impact, which had good and bad consequences. But we didn't get a chance to. We should delve more into that, because it's really interesting.
Let's schedule it. Thank you so much. I want to debrief with you for one moment, but my bladder is screaming at me right now, so we can end it there. Okay. Thank you so much again, Rowan, and let's do this again.
My pleasure, John.